Allied armored advances from prepared positions. In practice, this meant it was often deployed in small numbers, frequently without adequate infantry or reconnaissance support. Jagdtiger's large route, and restricted traverse its fixed especially in urban rural terrain. While its gun was devastating, its slow rate of fire allowed the multiple fans were contrast between its theoretical battlefield supremacy and its operational limitations. Jagdtiger's sure to triumph. The origins of the Jagdtiger can be traced back to Germany's obsession with decisive technical superiority. After encountering heavily armored Soviet vehicles like the KV series and later the IS tanks, German planners became convinced that victory depended on outgunning and out-armoring the enemy rather than adapting tactics or production methods. In 1943, Hitler personally demanded a vehicle that could destroy any Allied tank head-on at extreme range. The result was the Jagdtiger, a dedicated tank destroyer rather than a true tank, reflecting the German belief that defensive firepower could compensate for strategic failure. Two main design variants were planned, differing primarily in suspension. Early vehicles used the Porsche suspension system, while later ones switched to the Henschel torsion bar suspension due to reliability concerns. Neither solution fully solved the underlying problem. The vehicle was simply too heavy for its drivetrain. The 12.8 cm Pak-44 gun was devastating, firing armor-piercing rounds capable of penetrating over 200 mm of armor at combat distances. Allied crews who encountered Jagdtigers often reported catastrophic losses when caught in its line of fire. However, the gun's size also introduced major drawbacks. Ammunition was extremely heavy, limiting onboard capacity to around 40 rounds, and reloading was slow, especially under combat stress. Crew fatigue became a real issue during prolonged engagements. Production was another critical weakness. Jagdtigers were assembled under constant bombing, with factories dispersed and supply chains fragmented. Only around 80 vehicles were completed, far too few to influence the war's outcome. Each Jagdtiger consumed enormous resources in steel, skilled labor, and transport capacity that Germany could no longer afford. Meanwhile, Allied forces focused on mass production, logistics, and combined arms coordination. The Jagdtiger required ideal conditions to function as intended: clear fields of fire, prepared positions, infantry support, and secure supply lines. In reality, it was often rushed into combat with incomplete training and insufficient support. Many vehicles were lost not to enemy fire but to breakdowns, fuel shortages, or air attacks while immobilized. The Jagdtiger was not a failure because it lacked power. It failed because power alone could not compensate for collapsing infrastructure, lost air superiority, and strategic overreach. It was a weapon designed for a war Germany wanted to fight, not the one it was actually facing. Operational deployment of the Jagdtiger revealed the full extent of the mismatch between concept and reality. On paper, the vehicle was intended to act as a long-range ambush predator, positioned behind the front lines, destroying enemy armor before it could respond. In practice, the rapidly shifting fronts of 1944 and 1945 rarely allowed such ideal scenarios. Jagdtigers were frequently forced into mobile defensive actions or even emergency counterattacks, roles for which they were completely unsuited. Weighing over 70 tons, the Jagdtiger strained bridges, roads, and recovery vehicles to the breaking point. Many German units lacked the heavy tractors required to tow a disabled Jagdtiger, meaning that mechanical failure often resulted in the crew destroying their own vehicle to prevent capture. Fuel consumption was extreme, and by late war, Germany was already facing a catastrophic fuel shortage. A Jagdtiger could theoretically dominate a battlefield, but only if it could reach it, remain supplied, and retreat when necessary. Conditions that almost never existed. Crew training also suffered. As experienced tankers were lost earlier in the war, replacements were rushed through shortened training programs. Operating the Jagdtiger demanded exceptional coordination between commander, gunner, loader, and driver. Yet many crews had minimal experience with such a complex machine. Reports from German units describe situations where the gun's power was unquestionable, but situational awareness was poor, making the Jagdtiger vulnerable to flanking maneuvers, artillery fire, and air attack. Allied fighter bombers were particularly deadly, as the Jagdtiger's slow speed and limited anti-air capability made it an easy target once spotted. Ironically, when Jagdtigers were captured intact, Allied evaluations confirmed that the gun and frontal armor were indeed formidable. However, These same evaluations concluded that the vehicle was strategically impractical. The Jagdtiger symbolized the final stage of German armored doctrine, an almost desperate faith in technological perfection as a substitute for strategic depth, numerical strength, and logistical sustainability. Rather than adapting to a war of attrition, Germany doubled down on complexity and specialization. The Jagdtiger stands today not just as the heaviest, operational armored fighting vehicle of the war, but as a cautionary example of how unmatched firepower can still lead to failure when divorced from realistic production, supply, and battlefield doctrine. When the Jagdtiger finally entered combat at the very end of 1944, it did so under conditions that were already disastrous for Germany. The vehicle was assigned primarily to Schwer, Panzerjägerabteilungen 605 and 512, elite heavy tank destroyer, units that had previously operated Ferdinand and Elephant vehicles. On paper, the Jagdtiger represented the ultimate evolution of German defensive doctrine, extreme firepower, heavy frontal armor, and the ability to destroy any Allied tank at ranges far beyond return fire. In isolated engagements, this promise was briefly fulfilled. Allied after-action reports described tanks destroyed at distances exceeding 2 kilometers, often with a single shot. Crews who encountered Jagdtigers head-on were shocked by their near invulnerability from the front. However, these moments of battlefield dominance were rare exceptions rather than the rule. The overwhelming majority of Jagdtiger losses were not caused by enemy tanks, but by mechanical failure, fuel shortages, or deliberate destruction by their own crews. The vehicle's massive weight placed enormous strain on the Tiger II chassis, which had already been operating at the limits of its design. Final drives failed with alarming frequency, suspension components cracked, and the Maybach engine struggled to move the vehicle even short distances. Marching a Jagdtiger, more than a few dozen kilometers often, resulted in breakdowns that could not be repaired in the field. Recovery vehicles were simply incapable of towing a disabled Jagdtiger, meaning that even minor damage could render it permanently lost. Tactical realities further undermined the vehicle's effectiveness. By late 1944 and early 1945, German forces were almost entirely on the defensive, reacting to Allied advances rather than shaping the battlefield. Jagdtigers were frequently rushed into positions without proper preparation, sometimes arriving late or being forced to relocate repeatedly under air attack. Their immense size made camouflage difficult, and once spotted, Allied artillery and fighter bombers quickly neutralized them. Allied forces also adapted their tactics, learning that direct engagement was unnecessary. Instead of attacking Jagdtigers frontally, they bypassed them, isolated them, and cut off fuel and ammunition supplies. In several cases, Jagdtigers were left stranded and abandoned without ever firing their main gun. What emerged from combat experience was a harsh truth. The Jagdtiger was tactically impressive but operationally impractical. Its destructive potential depended entirely on ideal conditions that no longer existed. In the chaos of Germany's collapsing front lines, the Jagdtiger became less a decisive weapon and more a symbol of technological excess divorced from strategic reality. Operating a Jagdtiger was not only a mechanical challenge but a severe psychological and physical burden for its crew. The vehicle required a crew of 6 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, radio operator, and assistant driver. Inside the massive casemate, space was paradoxically both vast and oppressive. The gun breech of the 128mm Pak-44 dominated the interior, leaving limited room for movement. Ammunition was enormous and extremely heavy, with each shell weighing over 28 kilograms. Loading the gun was exhausting, especially during combat, and sustained rates of fire were physically impossible. Crews reported that after only a few rounds, the loader was often completely drained, slowing the vehicle's combat effectiveness regardless of tactical situation. Ventilation was another serious issue. Firing the main gun filled the compartment with fumes, and although extractor fans were installed, they were often insufficient. Crews frequently suffered from headaches, nausea, and temporary disorientation after prolonged firing. Heat buildup added another layer of strain, particularly during summer operations or extended movement. From a command perspective, situational awareness was poor. The Jagdtiger lacked a rotating turret, forcing the entire vehicle to reposition, to engage targets outside the narrow firing arc. This made the driver's role critical and highly stressful, as even small steering adjustments could overload the already fragile transmission. Many crews described a constant fear of mechanical failure, knowing that a breakdown could mean certain abandonment or destruction of the vehicle. Morale was further affected by the strategic situation. By 1945, most Jagdtiger crews understood that the war was effectively lost. They were fielding a weapon that inspired awe, but also isolation. Allied air superiority meant constant exposure to air attack, and the Jagdtiger's slow speed made evasion nearly impossible. Crews often operated at night or under heavy concealment, waiting for fleeting opportunities to ambush advancing forces. Despite these conditions, many accounts emphasize the professionalism and discipline of the crews, who took pride in their machine and their ability to use it effectively when circumstances allowed. Yet this pride was mixed with resignation. Veterans later described the Jagdtiger as a weapon that demanded everything from its crew while giving very little back in return. It was not a machine designed around human endurance, but one that treated the crew as an extension of its mechanical mass. In this sense, the Jagdtiger reflected the final phase of German armored warfare, technically ambitious, brutally demanding, and ultimately unsustainable for the men who were expected to fight inside it. For the crews who operated the Jagdtiger, the vehicle was as much an enemy as the Allied forces they faced. While propaganda portrayed it as an indestructible steel monster, daily reality inside the machine was exhausting, stressful, and often terrifying in ways unrelated to combat. The Jagdtiger used the same Maybach HL-230 engine found in much lighter vehicles like the Panther and Tiger. In the Jagdtiger, this engine was pushed far beyond its intended limits. Overheating was constant, gearboxes failed regularly, final drives shattered under the immense strain, and track components wore out at an alarming rate. A single mechanical failure could immobilize the vehicle completely, and recovery was often impossible. Towing a 70-ton Jagdtiger required multiple recovery vehicles, which Germany no longer had in sufficient numbers by 1945. As a result, breakdowns frequently meant abandonment and self-destruction. Crew training was another critical issue. Late war, German crews often received minimal instruction before being sent into combat. Many Jagdtiger crews were unfamiliar with the vehicle's complex systems and struggled with basic maintenance. Inside the fighting compartment, conditions were cramped and physically punishing. The 128mm ammunition was enormous, heavy, and difficult to handle, especially under combat stress. Each shell weighed over 28 kilograms, and loading it required significant strength and coordination. Sustained combat quickly exhausted loaders, reducing the already slow rate of fire even further. Visibility was poor, with limited periscopes and narrow viewing angles, making situational awareness extremely difficult. The Jagdtiger's slow traverse and limited mobility meant that crews constantly feared flanking attacks, especially from Allied infantry armed with bazookas, Piats, or anti-tank grenades. Psychological strain was immense. Crews knew that while their frontal armor was nearly invulnerable, their flanks, rear, and roof were far more vulnerable, particularly to air attack. Many veterans later described a constant sense of being hunted, not by tanks but by aircraft. The sound of approaching fighter bombers often caused panic, as crews rushed to find cover or prepared to abandon the vehicle. Ironically, despite commanding one of the most heavily armored vehicles of the war, Jagdtiger crews often felt exposed and powerless. Their machine could dominate in rare ideal conditions, but most of the time it was unreliable, immobile, and dependent on circumstances entirely beyond their control. This gap between expectation and reality defined the Jagdtiger experience, at the human level, turning what was meant to be a symbol of power into a burden carried by exhausted soldiers in a collapsing war. Despite its many flaws, the Jagdtiger was not entirely useless on the battlefield, and in a handful of engagements it demonstrated why German engineers believed in the concept of extreme firepower. When deployed in defensive positions, on firm ground, with adequate fuel and functioning mechanics, the Jagdtiger could be terrifyingly effective. Its 128mm PaK-44 gun was capable of destroying any Allied tank at extreme ranges, often well beyond the distance at which enemy vehicles could even identify the Jagdtiger as a target. Allied reports describe engagements where Sherman, Churchill, and even Pershing crews were knocked out without ever seeing the vehicle that fired at them. The gun's accuracy, combined with its immense penetration, allowed Jagdtiger crews to dominate open terrain when conditions were favorable. In some cases, single Jagdtigers reportedly destroyed multiple Allied tanks in short periods, reinforcing the myth of invincibility surrounding the vehicle. However, these successes were rare and highly situational. Most occurred in ambush scenarios, where the Jagdtiger was concealed, stationary, and protected from flanking maneuvers. Once the element of surprise was lost, the vehicle's weaknesses quickly became apparent. Its slow speed and limited maneuverability made repositioning extremely difficult, and its long reload time left it vulnerable after each shot. Allied commanders learned quickly that direct frontal assaults were unnecessary. Instead, they relied on artillery, airstrikes, infantry assaults, and flanking tactics to neutralize Jagdtigers without engaging them head-on. In several documented cases, Jagdtigers were destroyed not by tanks, but by air-dropped rockets, bombs, or coordinated infantry attacks targeting tracks and rear armor. There were also instances where Jagdtigers were simply bypassed entirely, leaving them isolated, out of fuel, and eventually abandoned. By late 1944 and early 1945, the strategic situation meant that even battlefield victories were meaningless. Destroying a dozen, Allied tanks did nothing to slow the overall advance when replacement vehicles arrived within hours. Meanwhile, each lost Jagdtiger represented an irreplaceable investment of resources. Thus, while the Jagdtiger could still deliver moments of tactical dominance, these moments had no strategic impact. The vehicle was fighting a war that no longer existed, one where individual battlefield superiority mattered less than logistics. Air power and sustained operational mobility, one of the least visible but most decisive factors in the Jagdtiger's failure was logistics. On paper, the vehicle represented unmatched battlefield power. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare introduced at the worst possible moment. By late 1944, Germany's supply network was collapsing under constant Allied bombing. Fuel shortages were crippling armored units, and spare parts were increasingly impossible to obtain. The Jagdtiger demanded enormous quantities of fuel, spare components, and skilled mechanics, none of which were available in sufficient numbers. A single breakdown could immobilize the vehicle for days or weeks, assuming repairs were even possible. Many Jagdtigers were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they suffered mechanical failures that could not be fixed in the field. Final drives shattered under the strain of the vehicle's weight. Transmissions failed, and engines overheated during even short movements. Towing a disabled Jagdtiger was often impossible, as no recovery vehicle was powerful enough to move its massive chassis. In some cases, multiple recovery vehicles were destroyed, attempting to extract a single Jagdtiger from mud or shell craters. Fuel scarcity compounded these problems. Crews frequently received orders to destroy their own vehicles simply because they had no fuel to continue retreating. Ammunition was another issue. The 128mm shells were massive, heavy, and slow to handle, limiting the amount carried and complicating resupply. Each Jagdtiger required a steady flow of specialized ammunition that could not be easily substituted or improvised. Meanwhile, trained crews were in short supply. By this stage of the war, Germany was losing experienced tankers faster than they could be replaced. Jagdtiger crews often consisted of hastily trained soldiers, operating one of the most complex armored vehicles ever built. This combination of mechanical fragility, logistical collapse, and declining crew quality meant that the Jagdtiger rarely operated as intended. Even when not under enemy fire, it was constantly fighting its own limitations. In effect, the Jagdtiger became a symbol of Germany's strategic exhaustion, a weapon that demanded conditions the Reich could no longer provide. Beyond armor thickness and gun caliber, the Jagdtiger also carried a psychological weight that affected both sides of the battlefield. For Allied crews, reports of an unknown German vehicle immune to frontal fire created anxiety and hesitation, especially during the first encounters. Rumors exaggerated its numbers and capabilities, turning it into a myth long before it became a measurable threat. For German crews, however, the psychological burden worked in the opposite direction. Serving inside a Jagdtiger was less a privilege and more a test of endurance. The interior was cramped despite the vehicle's massive size. Ventilation was poor, and the recoil of the 128 gun was physically exhausting over prolonged engagements. Ammunition was heavy and difficult to handle, slowing reload times and increasing crew fatigue. Mechanical failures were a constant fear. Crews often entered combat, knowing that a broken transmission or thrown track could turn their vehicle into a stationary bunker or a death trap. Fuel shortages added another layer of stress, as orders sometimes required Jagdtigers to move only a few kilometers per day or remain hidden for long periods to conserve resources. Many crews reported abandoning perfectly intact vehicles simply because they ran out of fuel or spare parts. Training was also inconsistent. By late 1944, experienced tank destroyer crews were scarce, and replacements often received minimal instruction before being assigned to one of the most complex armored vehicles ever built. This led to operational mistakes, wasted ammunition, and poor coordination with infantry and support units. The Jagdtiger demanded discipline, patience, and technical knowledge. Yet Germany could no longer provide the institutional stability needed to support such a machine. As a result, morale among Jagdtiger crews was fragile. Pride in commanding a nearly invulnerable vehicle was mixed with frustration, fear, and a growing awareness that the war was already lost. The Jagdtiger did not symbolize confidence or momentum. It symbolized desperation. Each deployment felt less like a strategic maneuver and more like a final stand. In this sense, the Jagdtiger's greatest impact may not have been physical destruction, but the emotional contrast it revealed, overwhelming firepower, trapped inside a collapsing system that could no longer sustain it. The Jagdtiger stands as one of the clearest examples of how technological ambition can collide with strategic reality. On paper, it was the ultimate tank destroyer, armed with the most powerful anti-tank gun of the war, protected by armor that rendered most Allied weapons ineffective from the front, and designed to dominate any armored engagement it entered. In isolated tactical situations, it fulfilled that promise. When properly positioned, supported, and supplied, the Jagdtiger could annihilate enemy armor at extreme ranges and hold ground with terrifying efficiency. Yet war is not fought on paper, and the conditions required for the Jagdtiger to succeed rarely existed in late 1944 and 1945. Germany lacked fuel, spare parts, trained crews, air superiority, and the logistical depth needed to keep such a massive and mechanically fragile vehicle operational. The very qualities that made the Jagdtiger formidable also made it impractical. Its extreme weight overstressed transmissions and suspensions, limited mobility, and turned every movement into a calculated risk. Its gun was devastating but slow to reload, and its lack of a turret reduced flexibility in fluid combat situations. Strategically, the Jagdtiger arrived too late and in too few numbers to influence the outcome of the war. It was a defensive weapon introduced at a time when Germany no longer controlled the initiative and could not choose the terms of engagement. Instead of shaping the battlefield, the Jagdtiger reacted to it, often immobilized, abandoned, or destroyed without ever firing a shot. In hindsight, the Jagdtiger represents the final stage of German heavy armor philosophy, an obsession with superiority through sheer power, pursued even as the industrial and strategic foundations supporting that philosophy collapsed. It was not a failure of engineering skill, but a failure of alignment between technology, strategy, and reality. The Jagdtiger did not lose because it was weak. It lost because it was too heavy, too complex, and too late for the war it was built to fight. In that sense, it remains less a weapon of victory and more a monument to excess, illustrating that in modern warfare, effectiveness is not defined by maximum power, but by balance, sustainability, and adaptability.